Let me begin by thanking the organisers for the kind invitation to come to this wonderful festival of ideas. What I'm going to bring to you are two ideas and a concern. And the two ideas and a concern revolve around this process of reproduction and our reproductive fate. So at the University of Newcastle, we have a research group which focuses on the reproductive process. It's not something that we talk very much about. It's not something which is discussed much in the media. But as I try to indicate in this talk, it's something which I think is very important to us all. And the place I'm going to start this particular talk is just by looking at a snapshot of what's happened to world population growth since the dawn of time. Amazingly, it took from the dawn of time until 1850 to generate a world population of 1 billion people. We paused briefly for the Black Death, but once we'd figured out how to harness all the energy bound up in fossil fuels and had better primary health care, there was really no stopping us. And we shot past 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 weeks ago, we shot past 7 billion people on the planet, and we are heading for 9 billion people by the year 2050. It's an unsustainable rate of growth. And one of the interesting things about this growth is that it's very uneven in different parts of the world. So in developed countries, like Australia, world population the population numbers are actually coming down. Whereas in the less developed nations of the world, they're going up. And the result of these disparate trends is that by the year 2050, 90% of the world's population will be living in developing countries. Think of that. By 2050, 90% of the world's population will be in developing countries. And this disparity obviously creates tensions that we see all over the world now. There's pressures on borders wherever we look. And somehow this situation has to be resolved. The solution to the problem is not simple. It's certainly part political, it's partly social, but it's also partly technical. Every year, the contraceptive needs of some 400 million people go unmet. One of the consequences of that is that every year, our planet witnesses 46 million abortions. 46 million abortions because of contraceptive failure. And a woman having an abortion in Africa is 7,000 times more likely to die of the procedure than the equivalent woman in Australia. And then the thing which I think is one of the most remarkable facets of all of this is that there have been no radically new forms of contraception since the pill was introduced in 1960. And think about that. You think of all the miracles of modern medicine that have transformed healthcare in the last half century. And here is something that touches all of our lives, and it's been completely neglected. And indeed, just 2 years ago, the last big pharmaceutical company working in contraceptive research pulled out. So now there is no big company working in contraception. If we are to develop better methods of regulating our population growth, it's not going to be the major pharmaceuticals that are going to do it for us. It's going to be people like ourselves, scientists working in public sector research institutions, and universities like the University of Newcastle, where we have a very large reproductive science group, that are going to come up with the answers. Whatever forms of contraception we develop for the future, they are going to be different from the ones that we developed in the 1960s. Because nowadays we face quite a different situation. So in the 1960s, it was okay to introduce the pill, which really focuses on just suppressing fertility. But nowadays we face another problem, which is that there is a global pandemic in sexually transmitted diseases. I put up here the data for chlamydia simply because this is the most prevalent one in Australia. But in Australia, young girls between the ages of 15 and 25 are very vulnerable to chlamydial infection. It is the most powerful or most common infection of any kind in Australia, in North America, and along with that and herpes simplex virus and gonorrhea are the three major sexually transmitted diseases. And I haven't even begun to talk about AIDS. We've become slightly hardened to AIDS, but every day, 7,500 new cases of AIDS are notified. So whatever new forms of contraception we develop for the future, we should think about methods of regulating fertility that would protect the user simultaneously against both pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease, okay? And that is essentially the task that we set ourselves, and it's the first of my ideas that I wanted to get across. So, if you go to a chemist and you buy a spermicide, you can buy standalone spermicides, or they come in on the surface of condoms or diaphragms. The compound that you're buying is actually a detergent. It's called nonoxynol 9. It has its origins in the 1920s. And that, again, tells you something. There's been no movement, even in something as simple as a spermicide, since the 1920s. It's a very toxic compound. It certainly kills spermatozoa, but it kills all sorts of other things as well. And women who use this spermicide are more susceptible to HIV, not less susceptible as a consequence. So we need to get things that are better than nonoxynol 9. And so in our laboratory in Newcastle, we've been developing such compounds. This is basically a simple graph. It just tells you how much compound you need to immobilize about 10 million sperm cells in 20 seconds. That's the global standard for spermicide researchers. You've got to immobilize 10 million sperm cells in 20 seconds. And you can do that with quite a large dose of nonoxynol 9. Here are some of the compounds we've developed, and the ones I draw your attention to are the ones down here, where we can achieve exactly the same effect, but with a fraction of the dose. And actually, it's not quite the same effect, because nonoxynol 9, as I've already said, kills everything. Our compounds don't kill the spermatozoa at all. What they do is actually paralyze these cells. And if we look at the vitality of the cells, they're remaining about 90% vital. No problems with their vitality. So I thought I'd just show you a little bit of video of this working. So here are some sperm cells swimming around. And then what I do on this piece of video clip is I add one of these compounds there. And what you see is the instant arrest of sperm movement. They're not dead. They're just sleeping. So it's so cool. We'll show it again. So here they are, and there. Gone. Instantaneously arrested their movement. And the really beautiful thing about this particular compound is that it not only paralyzes sperm movement, but it also has an inhibitory effect on chlamydial infection. So this is the assay that we use in a laboratory to look for chlamydial infections. These are McCoy cells, and these very dark brown ones are ones that have become infected with chlamydia. Our compounds here are as powerful as pen-strep, which is a very powerful antibiotic combination, as powerful as pen-strep at suppressing the infectivity of chlamydia. So here we are. We have a group of compounds that I can't tell you everything about them because I'd have to murder you then. It would be compromise our intellectual property position. But this group of compounds, very, very powerful, suppress sperm movement, suppress sexually transmitted disease. And one other feature I haven't really mentioned is the fact that these compounds are all activated on contact with semen. So it means that the whole way that you use these compounds is now quite different from the way that we traditionally use spermicides. So it's some advances in that area. And now what I want to do is to turn to the other side of the coin, which is infertility. So we've talked a lot about how our population is growing rapidly and how we need to find better ways of controlling the population. But in developed countries, we have the opposite problem. We have very low levels of fertility. This is a graph of the uptake of assisted conception therapy in Australia and New Zealand over the last 20 years. We are now at a point in that graph where 1 in every 30 children, that's 1 child in every high school class, is the product of assisted conception. It's an enormously large number, and as you can see from the graph, the trend is exponentially upwards. And in some countries now, like Denmark, we're looking at 1 in 20 children being the product of assisted conception. Why is this? Why is our society taking recourse to assisted conception with such vigor? Well, there are 2 major reasons. And the first one is maternal age. So, this is an idealized picture of a reproductive lifespan of somebody in Newcastle. After menarche, women don't ovulate for 2 or 3 years. They have cycles, but they don't ovulate. But then as soon as they start to ovulate, their fertility rises very rapidly, and women are at their most fertile when they're about 19 years old. Fertility then remains relatively constant until, and it's almost like a very precise inflection point at 35. And between the ages of 35 and 40, fertility declines dramatically, and fertility is unlikely over the age of 44. So this is the reproductive lifestyle of somebody in Newcastle. And what we are trying to do in our society is to start our reproductive life as we get towards its end. The age of first child in Australia is about the age of 30. In the next slide, I just want to emphasize what this means. So in the bottom panel here, I've got the reproductive life cycle of a woman from the Kalahari Desert. She's a Kung hunter-gatherer. And she also has menarche, but then she has her first child at the age of 19.5. So when women are at their most fertile, that's exactly when the hunter-gatherers have their first child. And then life is an alternating sequence of pregnancy and lactation. Pregnancy, lactation, pregnancy, lactation, pregnancy, lactation. And it goes on average for about 5 pregnancies. Interestingly enough, the hunter-gatherer woman will hardly ever have a menstrual cycle. So we think of the menstrual cycle as being something that's quite normal, something that women should experience. But in fact, primeval woman, the way that we are evolved to reproduce, doesn't really feature menstrual cycles. Life is just pregnancy and lactation. And the important thing to note is that the hunter-gatherer, reproducing as we're meant to reproduce, is ceasing her reproductive lifespan when women in our society are starting theirs. And as I said, we have a long period of cultural infertility through the use of contraception when the menstrual cycle dominates, and then we have a very brief window when we try to squeeze our families into that little gap between the ages of 30 and 35. And it's women trying to reproduce, extend that window forward, who are the ones who are turning up at our infertility clinics. So age is certainly the enemy of reproduction. And something in this has to change, and it cannot be the biology. That's fixed. Okay. The other major cause of human infertility is a surprise to many people, but it's male infertility. And it turns out that the male factor is probably the largest single reason why Australian couples have to have IVF. Roughly 1 in 20 males is infertile. That's a very large number, and the tragedy is that for most men, we have really no idea why they have that condition. Most men produce spermatozoa, certainly enough to fertilize an egg, but for some reason their spermatozoa have lost the potential for fertilization. So male infertility turns out to be really relatively common. And it is, in some ways, like female reproduction, affected by age. But it's a different kind of effect. As men get older, they don't stop producing spermatozoa. Grandfathers will still produce spermatozoa. This is Nanu Ramyogi. He is the oldest father in the world. He is 90 years old. And apparently intends having more children. It's just got going. So with age, men don't stop reproducing in terms of producing spermatozoa that will sire children. But what does happen is that the quality of their spermatozoa goes off. So as men get older, there's more and more damage to their spermatozoa, and the risk of birth defects increases linearly with the age of the father. And there are all kinds of examples of that. I've just shown you two here in this slide. One is miscarriage, so the chances that the pregnancy will be so compromised it will miscarry increases with the age of the father. The risk that the child will have a polygenic neurological condition like spontaneous schizophrenia, bipolar disease, or as I show in the example here, autism, that is linear related to the age of the father. So as men get older, they don't stop being able to reproduce, but the chances that there will be a problem in their child increases linearly with their age. Dominant genetic disease, all dominant genetic diseases in our species originate in the male, never the female, and they are exponentially correlated in that case with the age of the father. So we have to be wary of the fact that as men age, their gametes deteriorate. Why do they deteriorate? Well, one of the things that we know happens is that the sperm cell is a deceptively simple cell, really. It's just got a tail, and at the top end, it's got a little tiny nucleus which contains all the genetic material. And what happens is that genetic material starts to fragment. And if you look at an old man over the age of 36, his spermatozoa, yes, I know. Apparently over the age of 57, we don't bother thinking about these sort of things anymore. But these older men have 3 times the amount of DNA damage in their gametes as the younger men. And there is a linear relationship between the amount of DNA damage in the sperm cell and age. So this, for IVF technologists, does create a bit of a problem, because when you're doing IVF, it's obviously very important that you select the very best gametes for conception. So how do you select those good gametes, given that there are so many damaged ones in the suspension? And that's where the second idea comes in. So we have collaborated with a biotech company in Sydney called NewCep, and we have built a device, and it's based on 2 basic principles. One is that the sperm cell is the smallest cell in the body, so we can separate sperm cells from all other cells by means of a molecular sieve, which just keeps all these larger contaminating cells out. And then the second thing is that these cells, good cells, carry a high net negative charge. And so we're able to use an electrophoretic system to pull these cells across and purify them. And it works really quickly. I demonstrated this originally for the company using red blood cells, and we showed like a red tide going across this cassette as we turned on the current. And these cells that we isolate are very motile and have very low levels of DNA damage and are perfect for assisted conception processes. And it takes just a matter of seconds, whereas all conventional technologies take about an hour. This particular procedure is now gone through clinical trials, is successfully gone through clinical trials, is now being commercially exploited. And just to illustrate it, I thought I would tell you about the first case that we ever treated. I developed this machine and had told the head of Sydney IVF about the existence of this device and what it could do. And then he phoned me up one day and said, John, I think I've got the perfect couple for you. This couple had been infertile for a long time, about 10 years. The husband has very high levels of DNA damage in his spermatozoa. And I can just go backwards. Here we go. Very high levels of DNA damage in his spermatozoa, not because he was old, but because he was taking a cocktail of drugs for a skin condition, psoriasis. He had lots of DNA damage in his spermatozoa. We took his sample, put it through the electrophoretic system, and basically reduced the amount of damage from 41% to 15%, so much less damage, and then used these purified gametes now for in vitro fertilization, generated 2 embryos, transferred them back into the female partner's uterus, and 9 months later, a healthy female baby was born, and they were so delighted they've used the same procedure again for a second child, so the process has now been repeated. So it's a very powerful technology, and it just works beautifully. So to sort of pull everything together, what I've tried to illustrate to you is that reproduction is a very important process, obviously, for our species, and it's a particular process that has two sides to it. On the one hand, as a species, we are reproducing too fast, and we're reproducing in parts of the world where high population densities cannot be sustained. So to address that, we need better methods of regulating fertility, and at the University of Newcastle, we're working on these methods that will both address fertility and the spread of sexually transmitted disease. The other side of the reproductive coin is that in developed countries, we are becoming increasingly reliant on assisted conception. As I said, roughly 1 in 30 children now is the product of assisted conception, and a lot of this infertility is due to a male factor that we still haven't fully resolved the causes of. And then I said I would end with a concern, and this is my concern when we're thinking about the future of reproduction for our species. And that concern is that the more that we use assisted conception in one generation, the more we're going to need it in the next. With that, thank you very much indeed.